Good afternoon, Tech Nation. Welcome to another Webinar Wednesday. We are excited to have over 250 registered attendees for today's webinar, which is eligible for 0.1 TE credits from the ACI. Let's get started by giving away one lucky attendee a Tech Nation Tour t-shirt. Cleveland, Ohio is home to PartsSource and the 2016 NBA champions Cleveland Cavaliers. How many championship rings does Cleveland Cavalier star forward LeBron James have? You can answer now by using your questions feature on your dashboard. While you're answering, I want to invite everyone to join us for the MD Expo in New England, where we will bring together the CE professionals and biomed community from across the nation to New England for 3 days of learning, networking, and the latest advances in technology, products, and services. Registration is now open. You can receive complimentary admission by using the promo code 16MDE224. That's 16MDE224. Details can be found at www.mdexposhow.com. All right, and the winner of the Tech Nation Tour t-shirt is Dick Herrick, who correctly answered 3 championship rings for King James. Tech Nation, I'd like to thank our sponsor, PartsSource, excuse me, the industry's leading provider of biomedical and imaging replacement parts through comprehensive technology tools. As a single source for parts procurement, their top priority is delivering outstanding service to clinical engineering, facilities, and supply chain departments. You can visit them at www.partsource.com for more information. Our presenters today are Nadia Ayuzadeh, IS and Clinical Engineering Services Director, and Mara Pare, Clinical Engineering Services Manager from Allina Health, and PartsSource's Erin Tournoux, Vice President for Client Services. Erin, you can begin whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to take you all through the agenda that we had originally sent out with the presentation. So what we're going to be covering today is not only Allina's RFP approach, which is the 3rd item in our agenda, but we're really going to take you through how to think about, project management. So when you're going to take on a project, what is the best approach? And a really important factor within there is managing the change within the organization. So we're going to share with you some best practices that we've discovered through not only our work with Allina, but with other folks and within our organization on the best way to manage through change. Nadia and Mara are going to take you through their RFP approach. And then we have some information for you on monitoring and reporting on your project. So on the first slide, looking at the project planning and approach, there's really a high-level process here that we've outlined for the group, and it's really how we think about managing change within any organization. So just a high-level approach to change, it's really important to think about because as you come up with a project that you really want to take on, it's important that you have folks supporting that. It helps with obviously getting to your target, ensuring that you're hitting your objectives. So this is the high-level approach that we've outlined. So step 1 is really defining and communicating the goals and objectives. So important, kind of a no-brainer, but it's really important to do that and to continue to reinforce it. The second step would be to include the team in any change initiatives and planning. The third is to reinforce the goals and objectives and the success factors to help ensure that it's smooth and the project is successful. And then the last step is to report on the progress of the initiative. And always remember to celebrate your wins. Oftentimes we don't pause enough to really celebrate milestones that we've achieved, and of course overall hitting the target that you're after. So on the next slide, we really looked at defining success and communicating the objectives. So what is the best approach to take here? So you've identified a problem within your organization or an opportunity within your organization. And the first step is really to establish the goals and objectives. So we find it's best to use a SMART goal. So it's specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, and of course it's time-bound. So I have an example there, which would be reduce the procure-to-pay time by 78 minutes per order within the first quarter. So that might be one specific goal. It's measurable, it's achievable, and it's time-bound. The second would be to communicate the opportunity and the approach to achieve the goals. And I have it outlined in this exact way, leadership, middle management, and remaining stakeholders. because it's really important to get your buy-in in that staged process. You're talking to leadership about, what you're trying to accomplish and getting their buy-in and their feedback. Next, talking to middle management, your managers, your directors within the organization, and ensuring that you have, buy-in from that group and the support from that group. And then lastly, communicating it to the rest of the stakeholders. Now you've already received leadership and middle management, approval and support, and now it's time to communicate to the remaining stakeholders. So on the following slide, what we talk about here is really looking at making sure that you're including the team members in planning. So in change management, you always want to make sure that you incorporate as many of your stakeholders as possible, and really thinking about and being thoughtful of who your stakeholders are. So within that, identifying your stakeholders and ensuring that they're included, you want to understand who your naysayers are. You want to select a project lead, and then you want to identify the project team. When you identify your naysayers, it's oftentimes we find it highly beneficial to have them be almost the most involved with the project. In some cases, we've seen folks use a naysayer as the project lead. If you can please the naysayer, you're going to be able to please the masses. So really making sure that you identify those folks. The second would be identify an approach that ensures success. So as you get your stakeholders into a room to talk about it, talk about the best approach. Get feedback from the rest of the group on what the best approach is. The best approach may be to phase the rollout of the initiative. Make small changes, starting with the smallest change that can result in the biggest impact, but phasing it might be the best approach. And then establishing a target date of completion. Not just a target date of completion, but completion dates too to all of your milestones. So you're ensuring to track against those, and you're diligent about tracking against those. That way you can keep everyone on the same page. And then two, celebrate those wins, like I mentioned on the first slide. When you hit a major milestone or you have success, really making sure you pause and celebrate those with the team. Lastly is creating a project charter. So number 3, creating the project charter, looking at the goals and objectives, the key stakeholders and the key resources, just documenting all of this information is a healthy exercise. Items that are in scope and out of scope, it's important to identify those because oftentimes we get into projects and all of a sudden you have scope creep. People want to add additional things to the bucket, of course, add additional things to the project. So really identifying early on what's in scope and what isn't. Possible risks, what are some of the possible risks that could take place? Identifying those and understanding what those are is extremely important. And then, of course, identifying those major milestones. On the next slide, we're really looking at reinforcing the objectives and the success factors. So you've established the objectives. Oftentimes, especially with long projects, it's extremely important to continue to reinforce the objectives and what's going to create success on that specific project. So the first one is establishing regularly scheduled team meetings. So one of the things that we do with many of our program customers and too with a lot of the projects that we work on internally is we'll establish regularly scheduled team meetings. We'll start with weekly to increase the frequency of communication at the beginning of a project. Then we'll move to monthly once some of the change has been adopted. And then lastly, we move to quarterly. It is important, after you finish a project to ensure that you're looking at, on a quarterly basis, are you hitting your goals? Are you still successful? Are there any things that you need to go back and fine tune? And with anything, whether it's a, like I said, a program customer that we're working with or any project, I think that the frequency of those meetings is really important to be thoughtful about. The next is track and report on the progress and the goals of the objective. So making sure that you have, frequent communication. Those meetings will definitely help, but you also want to provide a lot of communication over email, revisiting the project charter and letting the team know how we're tracking against those things, making sure you're staying consistent. That project charter really helps identify and keep fresh in everyone's mind, all the things that are in scope and what the goals are. Reporting progress to leadership, extremely important for you to know, the best way to communicate with your manager. Do they prefer over email, over the phone, in person, printed copies of items? But making sure that you're reporting progress to leadership in a consumable way. The last would be reporting on the progress to the remaining stakeholders, and all of the things that I mentioned above help accomplish that. So on the next slide, we really get into the case study specifically with Allina. So I'll turn it over to Nadia and Mara to talk through a specific project that they took on relative to a supply chain initiative.
Great, thanks, Erin. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nadia Ayudzadeh, and before getting into the topic, I thought it might be helpful to give you some context by providing an overview of Allina as well as our department. So Allina Health is dedicated to the prevention and treatment of illness and enhancing the greater health of individuals, families, and communities throughout Minnesota and western Wisconsin. We are a not-for-profit healthcare system, and we care for patients through a network of 13 hospitals, 90 clinics, and other specialty services such as pharmacy, home health care, and we also have the largest EMS service in the geographical area. I'm proud to say that in 2015, Allina was named in the top 5 of the nation's large health systems by Truven Health Analytics. Our in-house clinical engineering department is centralized through the system office. It's composed of site-based and traveling technicians that are trained in various modalities that support over 100,000 assets. Mara, who will also be speaking today, leads a centralized back office team that supports the administrative function of the department, including the purchasing of parts, dispatching, paying invoices, and running analytics. This centralized support model enables the managers and the technicians to focus on their core responsibilities. Okay, now that I've set some context for you, let's get on to our topic about supply chain strategy. So one analogy that comes to my mind when I think about the multitude of vendors an organization has to manage is that it can be much like herding cats. So what does herding cats have to do with defining your supply chain strategy? Well, you have hundreds of vendors. Your vendors each have their own strategies and sales goals. Meanwhile, your organization also has plans and targets you must achieve. This can sometimes lead to everyone going in separate directions. Like herding cats, it sometimes feels overwhelming to decide where to focus your energies. It can seem impossible to have a cohesive approach and strategy with so many variables at play. Because of these reasons, organizations often follow the squeaky wheel approach, where they tackle the suppliers that have the most issues or concerns. Here at Allina, we asked ourselves, how can we get our goals and our vendors' goals to align and move forward in the same direction? In this case study, we're going to share 5 steps that enable us to achieve this alignment. By orchestrating a clear and defined strategy, we could direct our vendors to move in the direction that would benefit both of us and would allow both sides to achieve desired outcomes. In considering how to define our supply chain strategy, we developed a 5-step framework for action to help us strategically achieve our targets. The first step is identifying opportunities. This can be the most challenging step because it's hard to know where to start given the size and complexity of a large healthcare system. We took the 50,000-foot viewpoint by asking 2 simple questions. Where are we spending a lot of time for little value, and who are our high-spend vendors? The second step is to define goals around those opportunities. Once you've identified where you want to focus, you envision the ideal outcome at the beginning of the process. For Allina, it was to reduce the cost and time associated with parts ordering and to reduce the cost of service contracts. The third step is to gather data. Accurate data and information is instrumental in assessing the strategy's impact to the organization. The data can also narrow the options and help you focus on the most critical areas of your strategy. This step assisted Allina to feel confident that we were moving in the right direction and focusing on the key vendors and parts of our business. The fourth step is to use the data and analytics to define a clear and concise strategy. This step can be the easiest if you took the time to thoroughly complete the previous step. We all want to skip the gathering data step, but it is so important to the process because the data and assessments will point you to where you can get the biggest bang for your buck. Once you know that information, then you can develop a strategy that will allow you to achieve your goals. Finally, you are ready to take the last step, putting a plan together to implement the strategy. It's important to continue to be systematic and diligent in this last step. Clear and defined plans for strategy implementation must include things such as a detailed timeline, RFPs, and meetings with stakeholders. Now I'll turn it over to Mara to talk in detail about how we use these 5 steps to tackle our first goal, which was parts management.
Thanks, Nadia. So when we at Allina came together and thought about what our immediate opportunities that we had to streamline our process and costs were, there was one topic that definitely quickly arose to the top of our priority list, and that was our parts management process. We identified that there were redundant processes being carried out by both our technicians and our centralized buyer, and this combined with the fact that we had no time or resources to track metrics or follow up on orders was leading to overworked staff and definitely causing rising costs. From the moment the technician was sourcing their part and putting their requisition in our CMMS system, through the placement of the order with the vendor and the processing and invoice payment by our AP department, we determined that the procurement process for one order was an average of 78 minutes. What could we do to refocus our time and energy on our core strength of providing excellent service? Well, when we thought about it, the answer seemed straightforward. We needed to outsource the sourcing. Our goal was really threefold. We wanted to cut down dramatically on the time that it took to process parts orders. We really wanted to reduce the overall cost, and we also wanted to improve the quality of service and parts that we were receiving. So we decided that part of the solution was to look for vendors that were ISO certified so that we could ensure that our vendors had a formal quality plan in place. Next, we set about gathering as much data as we could about our parts spend. We pulled historical spend at the line item level for the prior 2 years, and then we took this data and we compared it to the annual cost and annual number of orders. We at Allina were consistently logging over 4,000 separate parts transactions on an annual basis, and we were spending between $2 and $3 million a year on parts. Through this process, we identified what 10 vendors we spent the most with on an annual basis and where we could get the biggest bang for our buck. From reviewing this data, it was immediately apparent that vendor consolidation was going to be the key to our strategy. If we could go from hundreds of vendors with separate ordering processes to only ordering through a small list of preferred vendors that could provide a streamlined process, reporting, and metrics, then we could definitely achieve our goal. Once we had the data and we knew what we wanted, the request for proposal process began. So our RFP consisted of 2 parts. We looked at SLAs and we looked at pricing. We determined that there were 4 vendors we wanted to ask to participate in the RFP process. We really chose these vendors through research, through existing relationships that we had, and through recommendations from other healthcare systems. So now on the next slide, I'll give you a peek into how we put together and reviewed the results of our RFP. To give you a better idea of the criteria that we graded the RFP on, here is a summary table of the vendors that responded. We required vendors to provide line item detailed pricing on all of the parts we had purchased in the last year. While this was quite an extensive undertaking for the vendors, the responses really allowed us to gauge what we had paid versus what we might expect to pay with a new vendor. There were a few items that we deemed critical and could use to start the elimination process. We immediately eliminated vendor number 4 due to the limited type of parts that they supplied, along with the fact that they were the only organization that was not ISO certified, and they were also unwilling to explore integrating with our CMMS. We then eliminated vendor number 1 because they did not have online ordering, and also because we felt their pricing structure would make it difficult to really quantify savings from year to year, as well as it might limit us in what kind of savings could be achieved. So in the end, this really left us with 2 good options in vendor number 2 and vendor number 3, so we decided to go ahead and sign contracts with both organizations. Once we had decided that, we needed to implement our new strategy. So we'll talk about that on the next slide. The parts consolidation journey began for us at Allina in December of 2013 with our RFP process. The bulk of the work to issue the RFP, compile the results, sign contracts, and implement programs was done over a year time frame. Our main contract to buy both general biomed and imaging parts was awarded to PartsSource in April of 2014. We also signed and awarded a secondary contract to an imaging vendor. We invested quite a bit of time on conference calls and in-person meetings with the PartsSource implementation team. They helped us capture our current process, identify opportunities to streamline, and create a new parts ordering process that would work well for both our buyer and our technicians. Once the due diligence was complete, we hand-selected 10 technicians to participate in a pilot program in December of 2014. We chose these technicians carefully in order to get a true representation of the different viewpoints and requirements existing among our staff. We included imaging and general biomed technicians, technicians that love to source their own parts, and also those that were excited to hand the process over to a third party. And as Erin mentioned earlier, we also made sure to include a naysayer because we knew that if we could get their buy-in, it would make the transition so much easier. So our full PartsSource program launched in January of 2015 after in-person training sessions with all of our staff. And I think that due to the careful planning, coordination, and exhaustive communication between the implementation team and Allina staff, the program got off to a very successful start, and it continues to grow and expand. So now that we've talked parts, Nadia is going to give us some insight into Allina's second goal, which was reducing cost of our vendor service contracts.
Thanks, Mara. So, as I mentioned, while we were tackling our parts consolidation project, we asked those two magic questions of where are we spending a lot of time for little value and who are high-spend vendors. And so when we did that, we identified another opportunity around our vendor service contracts and relationships. But when we went to answer the questions, we quickly realized that we could answer questions from a global perspective. We knew that every year the cost of service contracts were rising, and Allina was, in essence, absorbing the cost. But we could not tell if our contract costs were rising because of inflation, inaccurate charges, investments in higher-end technologies by our end users, lack of training of our resources and technicians, or was it just everything I just mentioned, all of the above? Although we were centralized in our organizational chart, we were not consistently aligned in our service strategies across our health system. It was not clear how much time our techs were spending versus the vendors on supporting the various modalities in our system. So all of these uncertainties made it clear that we had an opportunity to improve our vendor contract supply chain strategy. However, to take a systematic approach, we had to categorize the vendors by modality. If we could get a better understanding of which modalities were the most costly and which key vendors we should focus our energies on, then we could better set our goals and strategy for reducing costs. This is just a quick graphic dashboard that represents the service strategies used by different healthcare organizations by modality. Comparing our service strategies to an industry-wide snapshot also allowed us to better gauge where opportunities for efficiencies and savings existed. So now that we had that global view, we were ready to move on to the second step of defining our goal. Since our opportunity was to improve our vendor service contracts, we were ready to define our ideal state. We wanted to focus on our core strength of service while reducing costs. We set a goal to focus on key vendor partnerships and work closely with them to reduce costs through contract reviews and training on an ongoing basis. Next, we were ready to look at the data. The first step was to compare service contract coverages with our in-house service expertise. We identified which technologies were on a service contract and where we were managing equipment on a time and materials basis. We generated a list by vendor of assets and their coverages. We looked at parts and labor costs for the last 2 years. From this data, specific contracts were targeted to perform a service analysis. The service analysis took into account the number of units we had, how many PMs they needed, and the time it took to complete those PMs, the complete service history on the various devices, contract costs, time and material spend, and training costs that we had invested to support the technology. The outcome of the analysis provided projected savings opportunities that could be achieved by changing from one service strategy to another. The service analysis pointed to a recommendation on how to move forward with supporting the devices. So just to give you an example of what I'm talking about when I mention this data gathering process, I'll highlight an example with our CT modality. So Allina currently has 21 CT scanners spread throughout the healthcare system. By compiling a list of all the CTs, the types of coverages, and the actual costs associated with servicing the units, it really became apparent that we had differing supporting models across the board. For instance, some units had our technicians performing PMs, while others had vendors performing them. Although on those units the PMs were covered by contract, in some instances we were still incurring time and material expenses because some of our sites were not able to shut down the units during business hours, and so they were calling in vendors after hours to do their PMs. So in addition, our CT program operated on a labor and parts pool program that we had to purchase in advance. Some years we exceeded the pools, while other years we experienced the use it or lose it scenario. In both cases, we were leaving money on the table. By doing a comprehensive service analysis on our CTs, we realized that we were not calling the vendors in very frequently, and the pools were not helping us achieve good financial stewardship. The analysis made it very, very clear that a parts-only contract would be the most effective support strategy for this specific modality. So hopefully that example helps you understand the process that we're talking about here. So now that we went through and gathered the data, we were ready to define our strategy. So in order to better utilize our service expertise, we formed what we call Allina Technology Councils. We formed 8 groups around various modalities, and so some of those modalities include laser, respiratory, anesthesia and surgery. We have a lab group here, so we had a lab modality, obviously general biomed, imaging, ultrasound, and PCs. These cross-functional teams of subject matter experts included technicians. They had members from the supply chain department. We invited certain clinicians and leaders, as well as clinical engineering management. The ATCs are responsible for changes to and validation of existing strategies and for giving input on new technologies. The ATCs played an active role in reviewing the service analysis that was completed in the previous step. Armed with solid data and a list of desired contract items, we then approached our key vendors and set up regular business review meetings to include contract negotiation discussions. As a result of the ATC meetings, we also developed formal training programs where we were able to put together a plan for the entire year of the desired training that we need for the various technicians. And the training is really based on new technology that's coming into our system, succession plans, employee development, and obviously if we were changing service strategies. So this list was then prioritized based on criticality and the level of impact to the organization. And it really helped us identify opportunities within our service contracts where we could negotiate free training. So collaboration was key to implementing these strategies. We established regular quarterly business reviews to maintain momentum on shifting our service strategies. And meanwhile, with the establishment of ATCs, we were able to continue to drill down within modalities to find additional opportunities. Once we brought our request to the vendors, we worked together to develop service contract offerings tailored to Allina's needs and requirements. we realized that just because the vendor does not offer a type of coverage for the CT example, they didn't offer parts-only coverage, it doesn't mean that they're not willing to work with you to develop such an offering for the marketplace. So as a result of this exercise, we were able to reduce or eliminate contract costs, further develop the expertise of our in-house services program, and give our staff opportunities for more training and a voice in their modality service strategy decisions. By strengthening the service strategy review process through the establishment of ATCs, formal training plans, regular and close collaboration with supply chain, and our vendor partners, Allina is set up to continually ensure the most cost-effective and appropriate support strategy is in place at any given time. Now I'll turn it back over to Mara to talk about some of the challenges that we faced along the way as we implemented this program.
Thanks, Nadia. So with change, as we know, there always comes roadblocks and perceived obstacles. One of the key challenges that we faced with the parts consolidation project was just the transactional nature of parts pricing and really the lack of baseline metrics and SLAs that we could use to quantify our results. One of the ways that we approached this challenge was by working with PartsSource during the contract process, where we determined really specific metrics and SLAs that we wanted to track and meet. And once we had those in place, we had a baseline from which to track moving forward. One of the difficulties that also became quickly apparent was the limited integration that our CMMS parts module had with PartsSource. So what we did to approach that was that we worked with PartsSource to develop an alternative workflow method that we could use until we had more robust integration with our CMMS. In terms of our vendor contract project, some of the vendors we approached were unwilling or didn't have the capacity to provide training to us. Sometimes this meant that the only option available to us was to negotiate discounts on the service contracts themselves. In many cases, our conversations around adjusting service contracts resulted in vendors creating entirely new programs, as Nadia mentioned previously, and they really worked with us to tailor these service offerings to meet our needs. While this was definitely our preference, one challenge we faced was the sometimes lengthy timeline for vendors to put together, price, and extend new service offerings. If it's not currently part of their portfolio, sometimes that does take some time. Where necessary, we use this time to send our technicians to formal training so that as soon as a new contract was signed, we could really hit the ground running. So I just want to acknowledge that change is difficult for everyone, and we definitely experienced this, but Allina, CES management really felt that we could either choose to change in order to improve, or we could choose to stay the same and potentially fall behind. We approached change management in conjunction with our parts strategy in several ways. We were really transparent with our staff on why the change needed to occur, what were the problems that we were trying to address, and how this was going to address them. We presented the reasons why the change would impact their jobs positively, and we solicited feedback through meetings, one-on-one conversations, and surveys that we sent out to the entire team. It was equally important during the vendor contract project to receive the buy-in of our technicians that were closest to the work, because they were really the ones that were involved in the decision-making process every step of the way. It was vitally important to get their input when making service coverage changes, because we needed to ensure that the changes would translate to superior service out in the field. So the training investment that we made and that we continue to make in our technicians is a key contributor to their professional development as well, so that was definitely a key selling point. So after we finished completing these two projects, we sat down and we wanted to go forward and identify some of the best practices that we had learned as a result of these two projects. So one of the things that we learned was that we created an approved vendor list for parts ordering. We did this because not everything can or should be ordered through our two preferred vendors that we signed the contracts with. There are some vendors that Allina gets significant discounts to order from directly, and some vendors just don't allow third-party parts ordering. So what we do is we keep a list accessible online, and it's constantly updated, and that has approved parts vendors, on it that our technicians are able to order from. And what we found is that this really eliminates arguments to use the technician's personal choice instead. And we've been very pleased with the willingness of PartsSource to continue working with vendors that we identify to try to include them as a part of our parts program that we have with them as well. We also really recognize the value of continuing training and education for our staff. Even after rolling out the parts program, we have continued to consistently utilize webinar training. We send out tip of the week emails where we address frequently asked questions and issues as they crop up which pertain to parts ordering. We also created a space to give training and feedback during our regular in-person team meetings. Another best practice is that we've instituted vendor quarterly business reviews. And while this was really driven by the service contract changes that we made and continue to make, we've also started to utilize these regularly scheduled meetings to address organizational changes, service metrics, service trends and issues, outstanding recalls or remediations, and also training opportunities. And these meetings have really resulted in stronger relationships with our vendor partners and a willingness on their part to go the extra mile for Allina. And I would say that another best practice that we've focused on is that as a part of the dialogue with key vendors, we really found that determining our holistic vendor spend as an organization gives us better leverage during negotiations. So what we did was we looked at the total picture of what was our parts, service, capital, and consumable and supply spend, and we shared this information with the vendors when we sat down with them. And this is really to obtain better discounts as well as free or discounted service training. A really important component of this was a strong relationship with our supply chain group. And finally, as previously mentioned, we didn't limit ourselves to only what service contracts the vendor was initially offering. We worked closely with our key vendor partners to create new contract offerings that were tailored to our needs. In several situations, simply expressing interest to the vendor in taking our service in-house resulted in significant service contract discounts that actually made it financially feasible to keep devices on service contracts. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Nadia to share some of the successful outcomes of these two supply chain initiatives.
Thanks, Mara. So given the significant time and effort that went into these goals and strategies, it was important to go back and evaluate the outcomes. For the parts initiative, Allina has been able to consolidate approximately 460 parts vendors since the inception of the program about a year and a half ago. Although there were some hesitant team members when we started, all of the technicians are now actively participating in placing orders through the PartsSource program. In addition, by partnering with an ISO certified organization, we have seen a significant decrease in our part returns, while our supplier return rate is 1.6%, and that's pretty below the benchmark of a 3%. Priority shipments was one of our main challenges. This program has allowed Allina to greatly enhance our priority shipments because PartsSource has been able to process 99.3% of our priority orders on time. This means that when equipment is down and we need a part right away, we get it. And so we can make sure the technology is up and running, which is critical to the operational success of our customers, as well as patient safety. Thanks to the outstanding collaboration with PartsSource, we have seen a 35% decrease in the time it takes to process parts orders. We continue to work towards reducing this time even further through CMMS integration and implementation of EDI. In reviewing the outcomes of our second goal, Allina has substantially reduced service contract costs with our top 10 vendor partners, and we continue evaluating additional vendors through our ATC program. Shared service contracts were lowered to parts-only coverage in circumstances where our technicians were not contacting the vendors frequently for support. This ongoing process of evaluating vendor services allowed us to lower individual contract costs by anywhere from 5% to as much as 33%. By engaging our vendors as well as supply chain, our department has achieved free or reduced training courses. This has led not only to increased employee satisfaction, but also faster response time for our end user customers. And that ultimately leads to better patient care. So by defining our clinical engineering supply chain strategy, Allina has been able to achieve over $2.2 million in hard cost savings just in the first year we implemented this program. In the second year, so in 2016, year to date, we have saved about $1 million. So the trend is continuing to provide more opportunities for cost savings. So that wraps up our case study. We hope you find these 5 simple steps helpful to you as you define your supply chain strategy. And I hope this also helped create a unified vision for your team as well as your vendor partners. Now I'll turn it back over to Erin to share some tools and ideas around how to measure new supply chain strategies that are implemented.
So as I mentioned previously, it's important not only throughout the duration of a project to report to the group how the project is going, things that are going well, things that aren't going well. It's important to monitor these things ongoing. So I already presented this slide, but I wanted to reinforce the fact that it's extremely important to continue to remind the group of the objectives and the success factors. So establishing those regularly scheduled meetings, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and then tracking the report and reporting on the progress of the goals and objectives. So I'm going to give you several different scenarios on some of the reporting that my team puts together for our partner customers. So within our client services group that I manage, we have a team of program managers, data folks, folks that work on the integrations with our work order management systems and ERP partners. But with that, we do a lot of reporting back to the customer to ensure we're providing visibility to them on how they're achieving their goals and objectives. So at the start of a program, we'll very clearly understand what their goals and objectives are, what their targets are, and make sure that we continue to report that back to the customer, or internally, if it's an internal project, to ensure that we have constant visibility to those metrics. So this first slide, we're looking at the spend and savings. One of the priorities coming out of Allina's supply chain assessment was cost savings and looking at spend by product category. So this is a screenshot of one of the pages in our report that gives a snapshot of a healthcare organization's 12-month spend, what their average discount was, what the supply chain savings was that they realized on the parts that they procured from us, and then looking at some benchmarking data as well, which is extremely important. Whether it's benchmarking, setting baselines, comparative to how you were previously doing business, or comparing yourself to your peers. Nadia and Mara mentioned before, really talking to your colleagues, talking to people within other organizations or your suppliers, and really understanding what they're doing. That collaboration can really help. At the bottom of the page here, you see a lot of the tracking that we do by product category. So it's important for Allina to understand what are they spending on biomedical parts, imaging parts, glassware, and even on depot repair. So we provide metrics on all of that information. And then also looking at within the organization who's utilizing the program. So on the left you see user utilization, site utilization, and then the modalities that are being leveraged. So time savings, as Nadia and Mara mentioned before, was also a key metric that they were looking at. So they really wanted to look at reducing the time spent on parts procurement. So this is an example of one of the slides that, or one of the reports rather, that we provide back to healthcare organizations to help them understand how much time they're spending on parts procurement. So we actually did a specific time study with this specific healthcare organization that's on the slide here, and looked at how many hours they were spending on parts procurement, assessing where there might be opportunities for improvement. A priority of Allina's and this healthcare organization it was to reduce that time significantly. So through integrations with the work order management system, through integrations with the purchasing system, bringing that down, that procurement time down to 572 hours per year. So as you look at the various ways that you can place orders, it's really important to understand if the goal is to process as much in an automated fashion as possible, it's good to understand what's actually being procured through that process. So that's really what this is meant to monitor and report. So within a project and a good practice in change management is to really understand, I mentioned before, identifying who your stakeholders are, who are your naysayers, really understanding who those folks are so that you can monitor the utilization and the buy-in from each of those users. So this is just giving a snapshot of program utilization. This was a parts procurement program for a specific customer, and looking at the individual user. So the actual technicians that are purchasing the parts, are they participating in the program? Are they purchasing electronically to ensure that that ordering efficiency is taking place? But several metrics just to understand if that buy-in and that change took place is important to monitor and review. Another metric here is just to understand what the quality looks like. I know Nada and Mara talked about quality metrics, understanding and knowing what what the quality return rates are by product category from your suppliers. Extremely important and something that all customers should be aware of. So this is a report that we provide that really monitors not only the return rates due to quality related issues, but two, due to supplier-related issues. So if a part was incorrectly sourced or incorrectly shipped, understanding how frequently that happens is important, and having information that that gives you visibility to that is also important. So not only quality, but other returns that take place for process-related issues is important to have visibility to. So here we provide by product category, and then two, by return reason to provide that visibility. So as you go through a project, it's again important to go back and assess, not only on the front end, how did these suppliers, rack up against each other? What are the things that they are able to provide versus others? That's one of the key factors that I know Allina was taking into account. And something that we do in all of the projects that we manage is understanding what the options are, looking at, and doing vendor comparison on, the features and functionalities that they provide, the suite of services that they provide, and continuing to monitor that and ensure that they're continuing to provide the value that you originally were seeking. So from here, really, just the last thing to reinforce is, as you're planning through a project, just an understanding and remembering what those, critical success factors are, identifying what those are, identifying who your stakeholders are, and really being thoughtful about change management. Nadia and Mara were very, I would describe their change management practices as very thoughtful and very deliberate, which really is the best way, and very collaborative, which really is the best way to approach change and to help ensure that you're getting everyone's buy-in, from your naysayer to your supporter. So that's just really what I'll wrap with before we get into the questions.
Thank you, ladies. That was a very interesting presentation. We are now going to have a selection of questions for you. And the first question is, are there companies or tools we can use to help us develop and implement a custom strategy for cost savings?
Well, this is Mara. I can take a first stab at answering that. Certainly, as Allina was looking at these two projects, we were looking for, are there companies out there that have some tools that will help us to get to the place we want to be in an area that we don't specialize in. Since our focus area is service, and for instance, it's not parts procurement, are there companies out there that do have the tools such as online ordering and the ability to really source between all different types of parts, including, you know, OEM replacement, OEM, refurbished options, exchange options, etc., where we could have all that information in one place. And that was one of the reasons why we chose to partner with PartsSource, because they had that expertise and that ability that was not a core strength of ours. So I definitely think there are companies out there that will allow you to you know, use those tools that you don't have to develop yourself.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, if a biomed shop uses PartsSource to obtain parts, can the department still receive training from parts vendors?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I apologize. I couldn't hear the question very well. I'm turning up my volume.
No problem. If a biomed shop uses PartsSource to obtain parts, can the department still receive training from parts vendors?
Absolutely. For PartsSource specifically, we have various training programs set up with our supplier partners. So we partner with several people in order to be able to provide training, but we also have different programs in place that help you know, put money back into the department that could be used for training, you know, for this example or other things. So the answer would be yes.
Okay, thank you. Why would a vendor consider supplying parts to PartsSource? How does this benefit the hospital and the vendor?
I would say, so I'll start with how does it benefit the vendor. So with many of our partners, we actually you know, do business with thousands of different suppliers. The majority of the parts that we actually provide to the market are OEM original parts. So we do partner with the major manufacturers that are out on the market. What our suppliers see value in when it comes to PartsSource is the consolidation, the automation, a lot of similar things to what our customers see value in. The second piece is the reporting as well. So all of the things that I was showing you that we provide to our customers, we also provide visibility to our suppliers. So in many cases, you may have a manufacturer that doesn't have a lot of great reporting on parts. That's all we do. We live and breathe parts. That's all we focus on, and we want to do it great. So we provide to our customers and to our suppliers how we're performing, you know, based on service level metrics. That's what we provide to our customers. And we also provide to our suppliers a lot of information that they you know, don't necessarily have at their fingertips, what their back order rates are, how they perform on on-time delivery. And then, like I mentioned as well, the automation and the consolidation. You know, we're electronically connected to most of our suppliers. So when a customer purchases from us, you know, it's a very automated fashion in the way in which we're doing business with the supplier. So it's highly efficient for them.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned limited CMS integration. Where is that effort now? Does this mean that in your current state you must enter PO transactions into the PartsSource system and then again into your own CMMS?
That's a great question. Sure. So we, oh, I'm sorry, was that for PartsSource or
Go for it, Erin.
No, I was going to say, you go ahead. I answered the last one.
Well, I can only speak to Allina's experience, and maybe, Erin, you can give a brief answer about the other integrations that PartsSource has. But I would say that, yes, when I said limited integration, the current CMMS that Allina uses only has the ability to launch the PartsSource website from internally from our CMMS software. We do have to enter orders directly into the PartsSource website. So we've developed some internal workflows to do that and to make that easier for our technicians and for our buyer. We are looking to upgrade soon and to have some more robust integration in place, which Erin can probably speak to.
No, that's a great point. And with the work order management system that Allina has today, as Mara mentioned, it's a single sign-on. So as you sign into the work order management system, you can launch out to ePartsFinder. We'll be having, this quarter, we'll be having our second generation of integration with that specific work order management system, where there will be a data exchange piece to it. So as you look for products within ePartsFinder, all of those materials are pulled back into the work order management system, so the rekeying isn't necessary, and you get the outcomes of the great consistent data coming right out of our system. So we integrate currently with most of the major work order management systems, you know, TMS, Mainspring, Metamizer, Four Rivers. So we currently integrate with most of the major work order management systems, and I just named a few there. We also provide punch-out capability with PeopleSoft and Lawson and other purchasing systems like McKesson, where that double entry isn't needed. One, the materials can be pulled back into the work order management system, so that eliminates one entry. And then the second would be the punch-out with the purchasing systems that I mentioned, which again creates that automation so that rekeying isn't necessary. But you still get the benefits of the PartsSource catalog, which is nice. All of the features and functionality that we have within there, photos, parts description, you know, searching by model, manufacturer, et cetera. Even with the integration, you get that functionality as well.
Okay, can you share some of your vendor metric dashboards?
Absolutely. So we have on the last slide that I presented where I have the two screenshots side by side, that was one of our supplier report cards. And you know, just to name a few of the metrics that we report back to our suppliers, one is, you know, process-related returns, where they may have picked the wrong part, shipped the wrong part. Second would be quality, high focus of ours. We look very, very specifically at the quality-related issues, you know, based on product category, modality, even part-specific, to address any quality-related issues that we're having with the supplier. Back order rates, as I mentioned, on-time shipping, their level of automation. You know, the quicker we can get the order over to the supplier, the quicker they can ship it out. So we want to ensure that speed to market. So we also look at automation with the supplier. But this is on the screen here, some of the metrics that we report on within this specific supplier scorecard.
We can also mention from a vendor services perspective for a healthcare system, some of the vendor metrics that Allina tracks are, we look, like we mentioned, at holistic vendor spend. So we really take a totality of what is the capital, supplies, parts, service, what is everything we're spending with a vendor so that we have the strongest leverage when we go into a negotiation with them. On a regular basis, we look at PM completion. So if they're doing PMs for us, are they doing them on time? We look at first pass repair rates. Are they repairing things the first time they come out? We also look at various trending on repairs and also parts replacement. Are there certain parts that are getting replaced at a high volume? Are there certain repairs that are cropping up more commonly than others? And those are all things that we talk about with our vendors during quarterly business reviews.
Okay, do you have any particular software to analyze all the parts, order them, etc.?
Do we have a particular, sorry?
Software to analyze the parts.
Sure. So our current software does not track the cost savings to the level of detail that we would like. And so we actually use an Excel spreadsheet where we take every strategy that we've implemented and we put the projected savings that we anticipate to see for the year. And we track that against the financial performance on a monthly basis. And so whether it's part savings or vendor contract service strategy changes, we do track those. And as I mentioned earlier, we complete service analysis for each service strategy change that we implement. And so we know that going from a full service contract to a shared service contract, we anticipate saving X dollars for that change per year. And then we track that on a monthly basis.
Okay, and the last question is, what are the Allina ATCs?
That's a great question. So I know I kind of breezed through that in the presentation. So Allina 3 years ago did not have a formal structure around the various modalities. And so if we had a CT issue at one hospital, it would go to that manager. If we had it at another, it would go to a different manager. And so we felt like we really needed to form a space and a forum where the managers of the department as well as the expert technicians in the various modalities could come together to have strategic discussions about how that modality was performing. As those meetings evolved, we invited members of our supply chain capital purchasing team so that we could dialogue about negotiations that were happening. And this was a great partnership that allowed us to negotiate free training and make sure that the items that were being purchased were appropriately included the various components, etc. And in addition, we started to invite some of the clinicians to provide input and feedback on various trends we were seeing in the modalities. And so right now we have 8 technology councils that are formed. This includes, we have a technology council for lasers, we have one for imaging, for general biomed, for ultrasound, etc. And so these groups come together on a periodic basis, review the data, and help to set the strategy for the various modalities.
Okay, thank you Nadia, Mara and Erin, and thank you again to today's sponsors PartsSource. One lucky attendee will win lunch for their whole department. Details are included in the post-webinar survey, which will appear on your screen shortly. You must complete the survey to obtain your certificate of attendance. If you do not see the survey, email us at webinar@mdpublishing.com.